On the afternoon of March 25, 2010, a man named Richard Therian sat in the cafeteria of the Marlin Firearms plant on Shelton Avenue in North Haven, Connecticut, and listened to the Remington chief operating officer tell the room that the plant would close in a year. Therian had worked the production floor at Marlin for 22 years. He had fitted lever action receivers and timed the timing of magazine lifters and polished feed ramps and learned the particular patience that a Marlin Model 336 requires from the man building it, the way the tolerances had to be negotiated by hand because the machinery was old enough that it could not do the job without the craftsman making up the difference. That knowledge had not come from a manual. It had come from the men who trained him, who had learned from the men who trained them. In that cafeteria on Shelton Avenue, sitting across from a man in a suit from North Carolina who had owned the company for 2 years and 1 week, Richard Therian heard that the plant would close by June of 2011, that 265 workers would be let go, and that the work would move to Remington's plant in Ilion, New York. He drove home that evening with 141 years of accumulated Connecticut craftsmanship sitting in his hands, and no way to transfer it to anyone in Ilion who had not asked to receive it. That story does not appear in any Remington press release. The press release said the North Haven plant was closing for cost reasons, that Connecticut was an expensive state to operate a manufacturing facility, that the production would continue under the Marlin name at Remington's New York facility, and that the brand would remain intact. What the press release did not say was that a Marlin lever action rifle is not a product. It is a relationship between a mechanism and the person who builds it. What the press release did not say was that the mechanism needs the person more than the person needs the mechanism. The equipment was boxable. The knowledge was not. Remington shipped the first to Ilion. The second stayed in Connecticut with the men who were terminated. And the rifles that came out of Ilion starting in 2011 were different rifles from the ones that had come out of North Haven, in ways that every person who had ever handled a Marlin knew immediately, and could not quite fully describe except by saying that the rifle they were holding did not feel like a Marlin. This is not a description that appears in a balance sheet. It does not have a dollar value on a line item in a Freedom Group quarterly report. It is a description of accumulated craft. And the accumulated craft had walked out with Richard Therian and the 264 others who drove home from that cafeteria on Shelton Avenue in the spring of 2010. The subversion of this story is that Remington was right about one thing. The Marlin name remained intact. The name still meant something in 2020, when Ruger paid $30 million for it. It meant something precisely because of the 141 years of North Haven production that Remington had been working to separate it from. The name outlasted the damage. The question was whether anyone was going to rescue what the name pointed at before the damage became permanent. You need to understand what John Marlin built before you can understand what Remington destroyed. Marlin was born in Connecticut in 1836. He learned his trade as a machinist and tool and die maker, serving his apprenticeship at the American Machine Works before working at the Colt plant in Hartford during the Civil War. At Colt, he was not merely a factory hand. He was learning firearms manufacture from the inside at the precise moment when American gun-making was inventing itself as an industrial process, when Colt was demonstrating that precision machinery and interchangeable parts could produce a revolver faster than any individual craftsman could build one by hand. Marlin understood what Colt was doing with precision machines. He also understood what precision machines could not do. They could produce the part. They could not feel whether the part fitted the assembly the way the assembly required. That feeling was the craftsman's contribution. That contribution was the reason the gun was not merely assembled but built. In 1870, he opened his own shop on State Street in New Haven and began making derringers and revolvers under his own name. The derringers were small and not prestigious. He knew it. He was not trying to build prestige. He was building a customer base and a production floor and a body of accumulated knowledge about what his workforce could do. By 1881, he had produced the first commercially successful lever-action rifle that could handle big-bore cartridges, the Model 1881. By 1893, he had the Model 1893, the design that would survive and evolve into the Model 336, which remained in continuous production from that year forward through every subsequent decade of American history. 141 years of unbroken production, in the same city, on the same floor, from the same workforce. The knowledge moved in one direction, forward. Each generation of craftsmen handed what it knew to the next generation. The rifles got better because the people building them got better. The people building them got better because they were never dispersed. John Marlin died in July of 1901. He was 64 years old. He had spent 31 years building one of the most respected firearms companies in America, in the same city where he learned his trade. He would spend the rest of his working life answering the question none of his competitors were asking. Not how fast can we build it, but how well can we build it? And how do we teach the next man to build it the same way? A deer hunter in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Ohio in 2005 had something his father had handed down with specific instructions about its care. A Marlin Model 336 in 3030, likely bought sometime in the 1960s or 70s or 80s, when the JM stamped barrels were coming out of North Haven with the wood fitted close and the bluing deep and the action smooth, in the way that a lever action becomes smooth, only after the person who built it spent the time required to make it that way. He had hunted with it for decades. He had put the rifle through enough November mornings that the checkering on the grip had worn smooth in the spot where his hand always sat. The sling swivels had been worn to a patina that matched the receiver. The hammer showed brass where the bluing was gone from a generation of thumbing. The rifle had never failed to do what it was built to do. It had never jammed a cartridge. It had never miscycled in the cold. It had never sent a bullet anywhere but where he put the front sight. When his son started hunting, the conversation about what rifle to put in the boy's hands lasted about 20 minutes and ended with the 336. That is what the Marlin name meant in that household. That conversation happened in thousands of households across the American deer hunting range, from the cedar swamps of Michigan to the hill country of Pennsylvania to the pine flats of the Southeast. The reputation that produced it had been built in North Haven over 100 years by men who learned the work from each other. Cerberus Capital Management bought that reputation in December of 2007 and immediately began spending it. The purchase price Cerberus paid for Marlin was not publicly disclosed. What was publicly disclosed was the decision, announced on March 26, 2010, in the Hartford Courant and every firearms publication in America, that the North Haven plant was closing. 265 jobs. Production to Ilion, New York. A Remington foreman later described what arrived in Ilion. The machinery was aging, some of it worn out, hard to move and hard to reinstall, and it had been nursed along by skilled workers who had learned to bring the best from it. Only a few of those veterans moved to Ilion. You already know which side of this you are on. You have always known. Private equity does not understand what it buys when it buys a manufacturing brand built on craft. Cerberus Capital Management understood the Marlin name as a revenue line in a portfolio. They understood the Model 336 as a unit cost and a margin. They did not understand that the Model 336 was not a product. It was a transfer of knowledge between human beings, conducted generation by generation on a production floor in Connecticut for 141 years. The knowledge was not in the machinery. The machinery was a tool. The knowledge was in the men. When the men were told they were losing their jobs, the knowledge began to leave the building. When the men who built the rifles heard they would not be invited to New York, the last of it accelerated for the door. What was shipped to Ilion was iron and steel and aging tooling. What stayed in North Haven had no weight and no address and no dollar value on any balance sheet. It was just gone. The rifles that came out of Ilion between 2011 and 2013 were documented in real time by the buyers who purchased them and the gun shop owners who stocked them. Front sights so crooked the barrel had to be re-indexed before the rifle could be sighted in. Wood to metal gaps wide enough to lose a pencil in. Metal shavings found inside receivers, fresh from the box. Levers so stiff that grown men could not cycle them by hand without using both palms. Receivers cracking in the 45-70, chambering from pressures the material apparently could not handle as built. The actions on some models locked up so hard that the lever could not be moved under field conditions, leaving a hunter with a single-shot lever action. A gun shop in Ohio reportedly received a Model 1895 that would not function and shipped it back. A gun shop in Tennessee refused to stock the new production at all. The Marlin Owners Forum online, which had thousands of members who knew these rifles with the intimacy of long use, developed a word for the Ilian production, Remlin. The word contained both names and was not a compliment. Another term that circulated was Marlington, coined for the transition period rifles built by North Haven workers who already knew they were losing their jobs and had reasons to be less than fully committed to the quality of what they were shipping. Remington did not announce what this was costing them in warranty work and returned rifles and destroyed customer trust. The price of that damage was not disclosed. What was disclosed was that Remington itself went bankrupt in 2020, the second time it had been through Chapter 11 in less than 30 years. The financial engineering that had made the Freedom Group acquisition strategy possible was not the same thing as the management skill required to run companies that made physical objects that had to function reliably under pressure in the purpose. The company that owned the most storied names in American firearms could not generate the margin required to service the debt it had taken on to buy them. The brand names went to auction. Remington sold for $18 million. Marlin, the company Remington had bought and systematically damaged for 13 years, sold for $30 million. The brand Remington had destroyed was worth 66% more than the company that had destroyed it. The market for the Marlin name priced in what Remington had never understood, that 141 years of Connecticut craftsmanship was worth more than any financial model that treated it as a transferable asset. There is a Marlin Model 336 in a gun rack in a farmhouse in southern Michigan right now. The rifle was made in North Haven in 1974. It has a JM stamp on the barrel. The bluing is worn to silver on the lever and at the muzzle from 50 years of use. The stock has a crack in the wrist that was repaired with a wood screw sometime around 2000 and sealed with linseed oil and has not moved since. The man who owns it is the third person to own it. The first was a farmer outside Coldwater who bought it new and used it for 18 deer seasons. The second was his son-in-law who inherited it and used it for another 12. The third is the son-in-law's son who bought it at the estate sale for $40 in 2009 because nobody else in the family wanted a lever action. He has killed 11 deer with it since then and has never had a single mechanical problem with it and has never had any reason to think about where it was made or who made it or what happened to the people who knew how to make the next one the same way. He is not a collector. He is not a nostalgist. He is a man who owns a working rifle that has never given him a reason to think about acquiring a different one. That is what the JM stamp represents, not an era, not a sentiment. A manufacturing culture that lasted 141 years without a break and produced rifles that still work decades after the plant that built them was closed by a private equity firm that did not understand what it was. Closing. That rifle was made by men who were taught by men who were taught by men who opened that North Haven plant in 1969 when Marlin outgrew the original New Haven factory. The original New Haven factory opened in 1870 when John Malon Marlin signed a lease on a shop on State Street and began making derringers, the same year Ulysses Grant was inaugurated as president. The knowledge in that rifle ran from 1870 to the 1970s through a chain of human hands that never broke. No corporate transaction interrupted it. No plant move dispersed it. No private equity firm decided that the men who held it were a cost to be reduced. The chain was the product. The men were the chain. Every JM-stamped rifle that ever went to a deer camp in Michigan or a ranch in Montana or a whitetail hollow in Pennsylvania was the physical evidence of an unbroken chain of transmitted craft. The Remington acquisition broke the chain in Ilion, New York, in 2011. When production workers were placed on a floor with boxed-up machinery from Connecticut and expected to produce the same result without the people who had operated that machinery for decades, they could not. The rifles were documented proof of what happens when 141 years of accumulated knowledge is treated as a line on a spreadsheet that does not need to be transferred, only replaced. Ruger understood what the line on the spreadsheet actually represented. They spent 18 months re-engineering the production process before releasing a single rifle under the Marlin name. The first Ruger-built Marlin, released in December of 2021, was reviewed across the firearms press as the finest Marlin lever action ever produced. Ruger paid $30 million for something Remington had spent 13 years destroying. They paid it because the name still meant something, even after everything Remington had done to the product behind it. Two men at a gun show in any Midwestern state in 2012. One of them is holding a new production Marlin Model 336 from Ilion and pointing out the gap between the wood and the metal and the canted front sight, and asking the dealer if this is really what Marlin has become. One of them is holding a JM-stamped Model 336 from the late 1970s and explaining that this is what Marlin was and that the difference is not about nostalgia. It is about what happens when the same name goes on a different product. Both of them grew up with the name. One of them is holding the name. One of them is holding what the name used to mean. Remington got the name and the machinery. The men of North Haven kept what neither could be shipped. The tag says Marlin. The barrel says North Haven. The knowledge that made North Haven possible says the names of men who are not on the tag and never were. Therian, the workers of UAW Local 582. The craftsmen who taught each other for 141 years what a lever action requires from the person who builds it. That knowledge was never in a box. Remington never understood that. The rifles from Ilion proved it. Ruger understood it. That is why the first rifle Ruger released under the Marlin name, after 18 months of careful work, was described as the finest Marlin ever made.